And I said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Please don't ever talk to me about this again.
It was like, that's stupid, then that's popular, then that's stupid, and now we're back to that's popular.
So naturally, here we are, almost 20 years later.
Do it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast.
Okay, welcome everybody. My guest today, I'm really excited to have, and I think it's somewhat ironic that I get to talk to him. He might not remember this. I remember this vividly. In circa 2004-5, walking into the office, and Kurt looked at me and said, "Hey, have you heard about podcasts?" And I said, "No, what's that?" And he's like, "Well, it's like video. It's like radio, but you know, people record it in their MP3s, and then there's an RSS feed, and they take the RSS feed and it downloads to your iPod, which dates this, downloads to your iPod, and then like you listen to it on the train, and you know, it's like the cool way to consume like audio." And I said, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Please don't ever talk to me about this again." So naturally, here we are, almost 20 years later. Kurt Mackey, current CEO at Fly.io, former CEO of Things and Stuff. Kurt, how the hell are you?
Good. That's I like that podcast intro, especially because we're on like the second wave of podcasts by now. It's been,
yes.
It was like, that's stupid, then that's popular, then that's stupid, and now we're back to that's popular.
Yes. I'm always good at catching the second wave of technology things. I think also you were like, there's this thing called Ruby on Rails. I'm like, that's stupid. Please don't talk to me about that again. There was a lot of good stuff you were discovering then that I did not have the vision or foresight to believe in.
We just don't remember the really ridiculous things like F#. Do you remember F# programming language?
I do remember F#.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's not a hot.
No, I'm not
thing.
saying they were all hits. There were some misses, but nonetheless.
It's true.
Yeah. So I have my own version of your origin story, but in your own words, who are you? How did you get here? And where are we now?
I am probably a super average white dude of middle age who's landed in some interesting spots. I think just partially because I grew up with the internet. I think all of us at this age were kind of there for early internet and caught it at a point where we could both like learn, kind of become like intuitively recognize it. And also like, I think I'm fortunate to have been in a position to like kind of work on it over time. And it's funny because like I have kids now that are in college, and it's interesting to compare their difference, like kind of the different world they live in, and sort of notice like how cool it was to literally grow up in the late 90s. Like mess around with modems, install CD-ROMs in your compact PC, you know, all that ridiculous stuff. Build the most ridiculous ISPs in the world. I suspect like everyone we know built an ISP at one point, probably. I don't know if that's true or not.
Or a BBS, or both.
Yes, right. So I'm pretty much a product of the 90s. And the internet in a lot of ways. Like one of the earliest things I remember doing as an adult was working on Ars Technica back when it was just some people like building a website for fun. And everything sort of followed that in some ways. It's been interesting. And then like, I think I actually started a little later than a lot of people, but I ended up building a company almost from scratch in like 2011. And that went well enough that I could do it again. So it's a lot of honestly, like it's a lot of probably self-harm in some ways. There's a lot of things I could have done that would have been a lot easier, but this is kind of fun what we get to work on from scratch.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised it all works most of the time. I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm constantly amazed that we can even record this together just based on how many things have to go right between us.
Yeah, like I mean, you and I have both seen almost all of the duct tape and the spit that goes into holding the internet together. I'm mostly constantly amazed today at like cell phones.
Yeah.
Like every time I run a speed test on my phone, I'm just like, I couldn't even begin to describe this to like 1997 me.
Right.
Like what is happening right now.
Yes. I did the WiMAX speed test at the Morgan stop on the Green Line in Chicago. I got 900 megabits per second both ways from my iPhone. and it
Yeah.
got really hot. It was really funny. Like I felt the heat. And then I'm also irate when it doesn't work. That's the thing. It's like that's amazing, right? And then I'm like pissed off between stops when I lose signal and my FaceTime audio drops out or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm continuously angry at AirPods, so I feel like not everything's perfect.
Yeah, so I talked about this a lot with somebody recently about like video, right? Like just OTT video. Like 10 years ago, it was like, oh my God, look, there's moving pictures on the internet. And now it's like, how dare Netflix buffer? Like, what do you mean it's buffering?
What are these pixels I'm seeing?
Yeah. So I don't know what the curve is called. I'm sure there's a Wikipedia entry for this, but like there's the novelty to expectation curve.
Yeah.
Where it's like, it starts out as just like, oh my God, holy shit, I can't believe this works. And then, like you said, it some period of time later or some number of early adopters later, I don't know how the curve works, then it's just you're irate anytime it doesn't. Yeah.
The funny thing to notice about that stuff too is that you end up noticing the psychological differences of like video chats are amazing, and then you're on Zoom for 4 hours and you just want to die. Yeah. It's like, these are amazing, and also this is not what I've evolved to be be getting pleasure from. And then even the Netflix stuff, like I was reading how they make so many shows, as they call them second screen shows. So they actually create shows specifically to be good while you're on your phone at the same time, which is just mind blowing to me.
Interesting.
That this is a thing that came up in Netflix data. So
yeah. All right. Well, I'm told you have a clip. So what are you here to promote? Like,
yes.
What are you working on today?
I am working on a company called Fly.io. Now we're ambitious enough to call this a new public cloud, but basically it is a cloud for developers that makes it incredibly simple to run full stack apps close to users. And so what we actually end up doing is we give you CDN-like infrastructure for running a boring Rails app, if we want to do a throwback to the intro there. So you can deploy a Postgres and a Redis and even a SQLite and run it all over the world for your users.
Are you amazed that you can do that?
Yeah, actually a little bit. We started with stateless apps because they're easy, and if you don't have state, you have a little lower expectations. And then I think the first time we came up with a model for like running an arbitrary Rails app all over the world, and it worked with like minimal changes, it was like kind of astonishing to me that this is a possibility. Yeah. It's been very cool.
And was that your pivot? Like, apparently companies are supposed to pivot. You pivoted from?
Oh boy, we pivoted so many times. No, that was boy, we could get into that. All the things we tried, all the things we tried wrong. You'll get a kick out of this. So when we started the company in 2017, the entire like premise was CDNs kind of suck for developers. If you could make something that would really give developers power, it'd be big. It was like just big. There was no like specific size. It was like, that sounds pretty huge. Mm-hmm. And then it was a exercise. It was basically a 3-year exercise in figuring out what the hell we actually meant by that. And so we tried a couple of things, which were pivots, but it was all within the same, like, the general problem existed. And you're probably well aware of this one, where like CDNs are amazing for delivering the same video to 1 million people pretty reasonably well with minimal buffering, hopefully. And they're not so good for like dynamic applications where every user sees an entirely different thing. And that's like kind of the interesting apps to build. And so I think what's interesting about the pivots, we went from things that I'm too embarrassed to even talk about anymore that had got no traction whatsoever. we had a proxy we ran in 6 whole regions that all it would do was it would let you define webhooks for when requests came in to like alter what actually happened with that request. One of the things that always irritated me about like HTTP caching is how bad of interface HTTP headers are for controlling a cache. It's just like,
yep.
I like to write code. That seems terrible. I'd rather write an if statement. And so, yeah, we were kind of weak about it, I think. We were like, well, this is an easy thing to try. That's not running people's code, because that sounds hard and scary. And then we tossed all that stuff. The pivots were like from there to, then we built a multi-tenant JavaScript runtime, kind of like Cloudflare Workers. And then we couldn't get devs to use that. We get big companies to use it. but I felt like whatever we needed to, if like we're building something for devs, they'll probably drag us along. And if they're not really picking it up, it's probably not all that useful. And so I think the big scary pivot was from the JavaScript runtime to let's run any code. And then things like adding disks and databases were very natural evolutions just based on getting users that needed to do things. And they did start dragging us along. That was a very long-winded answer, but yes.
That's okay. We're here for the long wind. So you obviously, although you failed to really highlight it in your origin story, but you have a little bit of experience with databases, although not of the distributed variety, if I recall correctly.
Correct.
So maybe give people a quick background on Compose DBA.
Oh yeah.
Or MongoDB HQ DBA Compose.
Yep. So in 2011, I went to Y Combinator for an ad tech company and met this company called Mongo HQ. It was these two guys from Alabama. And they basically, it was like a side project that took off. I think a lot of startups are side projects that took off, and then a lot of startups are deliberate companies that you started from scratch. And I've learned these are two very different things. But Mongo HQ is a side project that took off, and I thought it was very cool because to me, the idea of just getting a database that worked without, and this was 2011, so this was novel. It was a time when like devs would try anything. Not true in 2022. It's a little harder to get devs to actually try things these days. But I did not get along with my co-founder that well, and it wasn't like it wasn't fisticuffs level. It was more like we just wanted different things for a company we were working on, which I've learned happens a lot during Y Combinator. And so there's like a little bit of founder shuffling that happens during Y Combinator. And so I ended up joining as what I was calling, it was kind of like baby founder position of Mongo HQ at the time. Mm-hmm. This was 2011, and then we just worked on that. It was very fun. I learned a lot about what developers actually want. That wasn't a pivot. The potential for that company was always to do automated DBA work for open source databases. Because to us, it was obvious that like if people wanted Mongo, like why not Postgres? Why not Cassandra? Why not Redis? Why not Elasticsearch? Why not any of these other things that I also want to deploy into my applications? And so we worked on that over time. Got a pretty good bottoms up developer company going, and then ended up selling it to IBM in 2015, which I've also learned is like free round of seed funding for the next company. If you sell a company like that for any kind of decent acquisition, all the investors just like push money at you after that. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. You're now a proven commodity.
Yes. Well, I think it's a one-time thing. I'm not convinced that I could go back and get the same thing. I think it's like you get like one free card,
one free round.
Yeah, one free round after an acquisition,
which is reasonable, right? Like if you're looking for heuristics, if you're an early venture person, successful exit is about as good as a heuristic as you're going to get on.
Yeah. I think a lot of what they notice is like that person just didn't. It's like they ground it out. It wasn't like I can at least trust that they're not just going to flake out in 6 months when things get tense. So
yeah, I think maybe it's Jason Calacanis. I think he said, to me it seems obvious, and maybe to you it seems obvious, but he I think has been getting a little bit of press saying, most startups don't run out of money. That's not why they go out of business. They go out of business because the founders give up.
Yeah,
to me that's obvious because you give up right before you run out of money. Like they're not. It's sort of a distinction without a difference.
But. It is. Yeah, it's interesting because it's especially when you raise money, you can almost keep a company alive forever by not doing anything in some ways. And so that's interesting. He's an interesting dude.
Jason.
Yes. But yeah, it's funny to always get investor takes on people who like didn't go start a second company after their first one kind of worked. I sort of like I did okay enough to like try like 3 investments in 2015 when we sold, and I was like, man, I hate this. This is the worst. I don't ever want to be an investor. But I understood why people go from like acquisition to investor, and like it's weird to start from scratch, and it becomes lonely to like do it again. And like, why would you do that? It was terrible. Like you probably gained weight the first time and your marriage might be strained. So like, obviously it's a poor choice to start it again. So
yeah. What was most frustrating about being on the other side of the table?
It wasn't really frustrating. I just didn't enjoy it. It was like, one, I like people, and I'm probably a bad investor because I probably just put money into a lot of stuff that just because I thought the people were smart and interesting. But there was I think it's very salesy. Like there was a lot of hustling and a lot of like meeting people and trying to convince them of my worth, and like that's not really all that fun for me.
Yeah.
So that's probably the frustrating bit. I think it was very, very like high touch, salesy, and a little bit disingenuous at times. I think investors like to trick themselves into thinking they're actually helpful, and
Right.
they can be. But I mean, people that are running a company probably just want money, and someone is not going to screw it up for them. I don't like
Right.
the bar is not much higher than that, and so you start getting these. It's interesting being like after pitching people again, how much of pitching an investor is almost like reinforcing to them that you think they could be helpful, even if it doesn't feel true, because that's kind of like what they need to hear sometimes. So
Yeah. Well, because nobody wants. My investment philosophy has always been, if I can't add value, I want no part of it.
yes,
Right? Like if it's just for money, and that's to your point, right? It's like if you're just like, I need your dollars.
Yep.
Be like, well, no, go get them from a bank or somebody else. If I don't have a way to create value,
Yeah.
my money isn't any better than anybody else's. But to your point, then, to convince me that you should get my money, you have to convince me how valuable I am.
That's right. You're amazing. We can't do this without you.
Right.
Actually, it's funny because like at least for me personally, the value is always, and I've sort of noticed this with investor updates, that like the most valuable investors reply to the shitty updates, and in the sense that they are supportive when it's not easy. It's super easy to get an update that's like, this is a rocket ship. All the numbers
amazing.
are good. This is amazing. You get all these woo, like kind of like cheering. But the really good ones are like incredibly supportive. And I've heard that a lot of them actually spend more time with the floundering companies than they do with the kind of the big hits. So actually, I do think investors can be valuable. I just don't think it's entirely experience based. It's like a different skill. You don't hear investors be like, when things go poorly, I'll be there. Like that's really the pitch they should give to founders, but you don't hear it very often.
Right. Well, I mean, you don't want to. If you think it's going to go poorly, maybe this isn't the right time to have this conversation.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
And the other one is just cheerleading in general is actually pretty useful. I think like, I mean, unashamedly being excited about what someone's doing is actually pretty cool.
Yeah. Just replying with nothing but emojis. Or,
Yes. The right.
Yeah.
Yes. Lots of water droplets.
Exactly. So you have an interesting array of investors now. How many you've raised 2 rounds?
We have raised, depending on how you slice and dice it, we raised a seed round in 2 parts. We raised a Series A and then a Series B.
Okay. So seed and then a Series A and B.
Yep.
And I think you mentioned that now you feel comfortable calling yourself a, what was it, distributed cloud?
Oh, a public cloud. We're
Public
ambitious enough to like compare ourselves to someone like Amazon, basically.
Right. So dig into that a bit. So who is your primary competition, and what is it like competing against $1 trillion businesses as your primary startup competitors?
It's actually super interesting when you're building infrastructure. So like one of the things I believe is that there's like, if you fast forward 10 years, there's a lot of what we're going to do is actually not being spent yet. It's not like we're fighting for dollars that are already going to something like AWS. It's more that I think that like the cloud market expands, and AWS is like $60 billion a year of revenue becomes like $300 billion a year. That's sort of not entirely up for grabs, but becomes like it's a thing that's accessible. And so in some ways that sounds less scary to me than really trying to compete for someone's money that they're already spending. Like it's a different kind of competition. And so I think one of the things that I believe is that the AWS, I'm just saying AWS is shorthand for like all the clouds right now because they're all very AWS-y, but they weren't built for a world where you run an app all over the place. They're very regionalized. They're very much like automate a data center that's in a city and then move your workload from your one city data center to another. And so I think they're pretty vulnerable in the sense that if there is room for like apps that need to run all over the place, they're probably not going to do a very good job of handling those for developers. And I also think they're not built for developers. They're kind of built for almost like cloud operations folks at this point.
DevOps.
Yeah, exactly. There's not like developers clamoring to use AWS. There's developers going to companies that have a whole fleet of people running AWS, and that's just kind of what they've gotten to. And so I think being developer first and making it easy to run apps all over the place is a good way to get a toe into like a very daunting problem. And so like at the moment, I think it's us and Cloudflare that think this is true. And so Cloudflare is putting a lot into workers. I think it's weird because we've done things so differently. We don't really run into them much, but there is kind of a category of market there that we were probably competing with Cloudflare with. And then both of us are probably hoping to be really irritating to AWS down the road.
Well, I assume you would have run into them more had you stayed on the JavaScript.
Yes. I think one thing I've brought up in pitches to investors at times has been like, we were somehow fortunate to not have millions of customers already. So when we shipped the JavaScript runtime, it was very exposed. Like it was either a thing companies wanted or it wasn't. And I think Cloudflare, if we're correct about this and we end up being the better company in 5 or 10 years or whatever, I think it will just be because Cloudflare's customer base deceived them a little bit. Where if you have 2 million customers and you ship a JavaScript runtime, you're going to get immediate traction from that JavaScript runtime. And we had 0 customers and shipped a JavaScript runtime, and then we didn't get traction because we didn't have like kind of a captive audience to put it in front of. And like that like there was a bit of an epiphany there where I was like, well, there's all these people still building Rails apps or Laravel apps or kind of like boring full stack apps that if we can just make those apps work, it's a pretty interesting thing that I think was only because we were starting from scratch. Which I think is pretty interesting. It's weird to say we were blessed to be, not valuable at the beginning and have to figure this out from like ground zero.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right that having critical mass of people can trick you into thinking something is more desirable than it is. Just even if you get 1% of the people signed up, like you said, you get 2 million customers. All right, congrats! You just started another business successfully.
Yeah.
So I'm working through this, so I might not articulate it as nicely as I would like. I heard ease of use.
Yep.
Is a big one, right? We need to make it easy for devs. Still get stuck when people talk edge compute, where everybody's definition of edge compute is different than everybody else's anyway. So we're all talking past each other no matter what. But I've sort of started to figure out that the more and more I hear about people's edge use cases and why they think they need edge, they're all like throughput problems that people think are a latency problem. Like it still comes down to at some point like transactions per second.
Yep.
And nobody actually cares about the speed of the transactions. They thought that was a way to get more throughput. What is the edge? What does the future look like? Like what is this new world of people trying to put apps closer to users?
I feel like the edge is like a useless concept for kind of reasons you just said. Like you'll find if you actually go to our website, which is okay, it says nothing about the edge. There's just no edge compute listed because developers don't understand what that means. I think one effect of the edge is you get things like you get kind of thinky type people within large organizations like T-Mobile thinking, oh, this seems like something we should glom onto because it makes intuitive sense, but it's not really anything most customers are demanding from them.
Yeah.
We tend to think of, I think your latency versus throughput is interesting because I think that latency and not throughput is actually what matters to our particular customers. And it's for a very specific reason, which is that if they can interact with their app, or if a person can interact with a boring Rails app or a JavaScript app or whatever, and something happens within like 40 milliseconds, it feels instantaneous to them. And so there's this latency threshold where there is a big like kind of usability win from applications if you can get below it, and it lets developers build a lot more interesting features for all their applications. We tend to call these real-time apps, which is again an overloaded term, but devs tend to understand what like Discord is a real-time app. If I'm going to do something that has like features like Discord, this is kind of the category of app I'm working with in. And we've had if you go on the tweeters and you look for us, you'll occasionally come across someone who's like, I deployed my Rails app to Tokyo. I didn't realize Rails apps could feel this fast because I've never had them this close to me before. It's kind of the effect that we've noticed from people, which is very much not throughput. It's not scale at all. It's a UX kind of quality of application metric that is good for us because it's like devs seem to intuitively understand that this will be useful. We don't have to like measure it or show our work too much. We just tell them run apps close to your users, and they're like either want to do it or they don't. So that's it. You kind of work in a world where throughput is the thing.
Well, there's still, so it's interesting. There's two definitions to throughput, which is also a problem with the and response time and latency and all of those things. So I mostly meant that what I mostly hear from people when they think edge compute is throughput in the actual total throughput of whatever they're trying to do thing. Right. We need to do X number of metrics per second, and therefore it needs to be closer to the users because that's how we're going to do X per second.
Right.
And nothing about the throughput of the individual transactions.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Right, like this transactions throughput needs to be 50 milliseconds or less, or bad thing happens. And that's where like the latency response time world starts getting fuzzy, because even the way I hear you describe it, I go, oh, that's throughput, because that thing that happened in 40 milliseconds, odds are, I always. There are exceptions, but odds are that was some sort of JavaScript or CSS or something that happened. And all of those engines wait for the whole thing to download before it runs that thing. So until it got the whole JavaScript code, it doesn't matter how fast the first bit of JavaScript code got there. What matters is when the last bit of JavaScript code got there to run that thing, which is the time it takes to send all of the data, which in my world is throughput.
In ours, I think one thing we can all agree on is that most measures of latency are stupid and not actually very meaningful. And like even when we talk about it, we're talking about human perception, not time to first byte. Like time to first byte doesn't actually mean anything, because there's a much fatter thing that happens, which is kind of throughput.
Ping at layer 7 is yeah. Or I've also started describing it as the time it takes to not serve something.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
That's funny. The time it takes to not have done anything useful yet.
Unless it's okay. So full disclosure, my classification of people and use cases where I don't get upset about people caring about time to first byte, unless the majority of your responses for whatever your app is are 304s. Right? Then, because there is no bytes, right?
Yeah.
Like your first byte is the only byte, and the byte is saying nothing has changed. Please come back again soon.
Yeah.
In that case, ping is a great measurement, or response time or time to first byte is a great measurement because that's the whole transaction.
Right.
But if the transaction involves sending more bytes than 0, I don't know what you've measured.
Ping is actually more relevant to us. We live in a WebSockets world where it's like if you look at what a user is actually doing, getting the WebSockets connection set up is one component. And then what we're actually doing is looking at almost like packets back and forth over WebSockets. So we get to that point where it's, but we still wouldn't call that time to first byte. We actually, you're gonna like this because I got right back to throughput. The capability that we're after for a lot of these is the ability to kind of have like 300 round trips per second for a given user. So over a WebSocket, like we want to have like, you should be able to serve video over a WebSocket. Basically, you wouldn't obviously want to do that. But in general, like pushing animation frames down.
Yeah, that's how our ultra low latency stuff works.
Oh, really?
It's all WebSocket,
Yeah. So we're doing it with HTML diffs, basically. So a lot of the stuff we're doing is actually like generating chunks of HTML on the server side, pushing them down, and it just gets diffed to the DOM for a user.
Yeah.
It's very cool stuff. I'm a big fan of WebSockets these days, even though the internet is not architected to make WebSockets work very well yet. So
yes, it's interesting you talk about the human perception one. Have you and I ever talked about the Delta Airlines version of this?
No.
So I'm stealing somebody's story, and I've heard different versions of it, so I'm not the only one stealing it. But the story, the way I heard it, was that there was a new small airport opened for commercial service somewhere in like the Gulf Coast of Florida or something like that. And there was, 2 flights a day to Atlanta, to and from Atlanta on Delta. That was the only commercial service. Service launches. Delta's super happy with all the metrics about the operations, all the metrics about passenger revenue, all these things, and it gets to be like end of quarter, end of year survey time, and they get feedback that this great new station they launched really terrible at baggage delivery. They're the only plane going to the only and Delta scans the bags all the way through, and the average flight on Delta, whatever, bags get delivered in 18 minutes or 22 minutes, whatever the number is. This station was like 7. It was actually on their metrics one of the top 10 performing things. So naturally, what do you do when something like this happens? You call in consultants.
Right.
And the consultants do the consulting-y thing, and the consultants come back with the solution. Solution was make the passengers walk longer before they get to the baggage claim. So they built a maze, because it turns out people don't care how fast their bags take.
Right.
People care how long they're standing at the baggage claim waiting for their bags.
Oh, that's amazing.
And so, the solution was to build this little perimeter walk before they got to baggage claim. So people had to spend 3 minutes walking to baggage claim instead of 4 seconds. And therefore, they only had to wait for their bags for 3 or 4 minutes instead of 7 or 8 minutes, whatever the numbers were.
That actually sounds like a pretty good outcome from hiring consultants. Like, I think I would be happy to actually hire someone and that be the result. It's like completely not intuitive.
Right.
You wouldn't have just guessed it. You probably wouldn't even have found that just asking a person because they don't know.
Right.
I think my favorite thing about any kind of human is how bad they are at telling you what their problem actually is. And that sounds like it. It's like, why are you mad? Because my bags took too long. He's like, well, no.
they were way faster than the last one you were happy with.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah, that's interesting.
I think about that story a lot when it comes to performance and again, perception of speed.
I heard a similar thing for one of the companies that did on-demand online printing. So you'd go design your business cards or whatever and click around and then ask to get this thing printed. There was this correlation between people feeling like something was hard and you making it actually look difficult that they found where if you click design my business card and you get the response instantaneously, it actually weirds you out a little bit because you expect some stuff to be happening in the background.
Yes.
But if you get an artificial loading thing for the right amount of time, not 40 seconds, but 3 seconds, you're like, oh, cool, that was valuable.
Yeah.
Which I've always found was really fascinating.
I feel like I see those all the time on social media. I don't want to call them scams, but social media, personal improvement things or whatever. It's so we're building your custom dating plan. Stand by.
Yeah.
Right. And it's loading. Oh, we're 20% done. We haven't fully calculated your custom dating plan yet.
Right.
But while you're waiting, would you like to upgrade to the super duper tier?
It all comes down to almost what you're trying to do is you're trying to do things the way people expect them to happen, not actually increase performance. And so when I click a button in a number of increments, I expect that to be instantaneous.
Right.
But it's not increasing performance. It's adapting to people's expectations and making things not surprising. Is
there something in developer world and Fly that you've had to do that? Does something work too well or not the way people expected and you guys had to refactor it?
Oh yeah, actually really early on. Actually, there were a couple. I run into this with developers all the time. So when we first launched the current iteration, the good part of the product, the one that seems to be working, not any of the previous disasters. What we did was we had you basically run fly deploy, and your app would get bundled up into a container. It would get put in the city closest to you, and then we just put it where it needed to go based on magic. And what happened is devs were so I hit fly deploy, now what? And so you tell them all this good stuff just happened, and they're they don't feel it. It was interesting. They're they kind of acknowledge that these things happen, acknowledge that it's pretty good, but they're left very unsatisfied as far as I can tell. And so we ended up changing, and even if you go to the homepage, you'll see this. We now tell people to run fly deploy, and then we tell them to add a region, like Sydney or whatever. Because that second step that I didn't think was necessary, it scratched that itch for people. Because fly, if you deploy a Rails app and you want to run it in Sydney, people acknowledge that this is hard. If we give them a command that makes this happen, that makes it seem easier, they seem to really, really get it. If we just automatically ran in Sydney, they were like completely unsatisfied with what we were giving
Right.
them.
If they're like, we
It was like a
geodetected your location and picked the node closest to
Yeah.
you, and now it's live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've actually structured a lot of our like kind of user experience stuff almost to, because we realize we're almost educating them on what's happening by making them go through almost like a game mechanic tutorial in some ways. It's not like we measured us like a game mechanic as much as like games are very good at progressing you through and increasing the amount of reward you get for a given given thing that's happening. And our goal in life, because nobody's run an app on a platform like this before, is to get them started and then make them feel powerful over time. So they and it's like a kind of a way of learning the thing. But yeah, that one really, really surprised me when we had to do it. And in hindsight, it's like we're making the product worse. It felt like, but no, it really sells the thing.
Yeah. You had to build a maze to make
We
people.
did. We had to build the really cynical take is like we had to build a maze with little treats in different places, and so they.
Why would that be cynical?
Wait, the hippie take would be people really appreciate the journey, and if there is no journey, they can't enjoy the destination the same way. So we'll call it that.
Okay, I like that. Just change gears a tiny bit. So you like fast cars and electric skateboards and things like that.
Did I tell you about the electric skateboard, or is there gossip about the electric skateboard?
Which one do you prefer?
Oh,
You told me about the electric skateboard.
Oh, okay. What
Yeah.
does it say?
So it seems like you would get enough adrenaline anxiety fix from working on building businesses. How do you balance work and play?
I need something that makes me stop thinking about work. So it actually there's like a level of intensity that play has to have, or I'm just it's not doing it for me. Actually, I was complaining to someone about this the other day. Like, this company is so fun. I will spend all my time on it to my own detriment, because my brain is just I'm gonna do this. And so the not dying on an electric skateboard is a pretty good way to stop thinking about work so far, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Cars, it's kind of a lot of work to get a car to a state where you're afraid you're going to die.
Yeah. Well, you picked the right track to race it on, I guess.
Yes. But even then, it's like you got to go there. It's kind of a plan. It takes hours. It's not just a 30-minute diversion.
Right.
So I've kind of gotten to the point where cars are, there's so much work. There's so much work outside of work. I have a really hard time with projects that are outside of work, because I do enough projects for work. So electric skateboard's the thing. And then improv classes, shockingly, apparently when I go do improv classes, I stop thinking about work for 3 hours. So it somehow does the same thing.
Ooh, yes, and
yes, exactly. Yes, there you go. That's it. I don't even know why I take a class. I already know that one line.
I imagine you do pretty well in the improv class.
Well enough to enjoy it. Actually, the best thing about improv is there's no risk of me trying to create a company from it. I think one of the things that's like previously destroyed all my enjoyment of things is like I very quickly try and create work from them.
How could I turn this into a business?
Yeah, and improv, I'm never going to make money. That's just like it's not even possible. I'm not at risk of making money off of it.
Right. He said as the wheels started to turn. Like, my wheels are starting to turn now. Like, online improv at the edge.
No, see, because people who do improv don't have any money, and people who create improv companies don't know how to run a business. There's like nothing there. It's just not even
except for SNL. SNL is the only. We actually had an improv. We had a CDN.
Second City, Toronto.
No, Upright Citizens Brigade.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember what happened to their account now that I think of it.
Do you remember how I said they're bad at running a business? That's
No,
probably what happened. They probably churned because they, ran out of money.
Yeah.
That's probably what happened.
Sort of related to the outside work stuff, you have a sort of generational love for aviation that I don't have the same reason for, but I just saw that the FAA finally approved unleaded avgas. And to me, this is like, I look at this and I go, all of this had nothing to do with the creating of the product.
Yeah.
Like this was just the one company that was willing to persevere through the FAA process for however long it's been, 40 years, and actually get it approved. I feel like you are somebody who also does not appreciate a ton of bureaucracy.
It's true.
And yet something like aviation only really is the way we get to all enjoy it, no matter how we enjoy it, because of all the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
How do you, like, as somebody who, this is a very strange segue. I just figured out how
I like it. I don't even know. It's very surprising. I'm curious what's coming. We'll see.
Yes. So how does something like process and bureaucracy meld into startup world where, you know, all if you're like me, all you want to do is cut through all the tape, regardless of the color, and yet there's people around you probably trying to create all kinds of tape to help the business do things without you.
This is a thing that I'm specifically interested in because it's kind of my like second semi-successful go around at this point. Like, who knows what the outcome of Fly is going to be, but it's like I get to at least do it again and see if all my assumptions were correct. At the last company, I was very interested in building a company basically where I'd enjoy being employed by that company, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
built yourself a job.
I built a company full of jobs for me, and then I wasn't getting to do any of those. So it was not like obviously the right way to do things. But one thing that happened there is it got described to me once as very Lord of the Flies, which I was like, that's offensive. It's not like that at all. It probably kind of was in some ways. Where you hire a bunch of people like me who are very snarky and have strong feelings about things and pretty much just get things done if you let them. There's not like you don't really have to like help them do things basically. And it had a lot of good things about it, but there was some drama. It made it, I think, harder to hire than it needed to be. It was impossible to hire like junior level people I mean, I'm sure we could have hired them. It would have been impossible for them to do well because it was like, again, like, unless you're like me, you're probably not going to survive at this particular place. Mm-hmm. This company we're doing a little bit differently because one of the things I do believe is that, like, especially if you're growing a company really fast, and we've gone from like 13 to 40 in under a year, and we'll probably double that in the next year. So it's like we kind of have to worry about what happens when 80 people hit this organization. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of reasons it makes sense to hire less experienced people, and a lot of commercially good reasons. I also think if you can hire and make less experienced people basically succeed, it's probably a sign you're building a good organization. Does that make sense? Like, mm-hmm. I think there's good reasons to do it. I also think it's like a thing to look for as we're working on this stuff.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that forced me to do was actually think hard about what I thought was important for me as a job versus what I thought was good for a company that we're building. And what I landed on is that was actually important. And one thing that I even at the time, I think it was intuitively important. It's like, I firmly believe if you can distribute decision-making power to people doing the work, things work better, and you can move faster, and you can roll with changes, and you can like iterate faster on a very complicated problem, which is not the same thing as no process. But what it does is it gives you something that it gives you kind of a framework for when processes might become useful. And so it's not solved yet, and there is like constant pressure to like. I have a lot of problems with process, but if you can, like, here we've been able so far to think about process in terms of like how it's actually helping people mm-hmm. to make decisions, to do good work, and to ultimately get promoted. One of the other nice things about hiring less experienced people is you can actually look for reasons to promote them, and if you are able to do that, it's like a good sign again. Right. And so, but I'm still like highly allergic to process, and we just started hiring engineering managers for the first time ever. And anyone who's ever worked with engineering managers probably knows that position attracts people that are like, I like to accumulate power and create process and not necessarily do things for the reasons that I would like them done. Mm-hmm. And that's I hate process for the sake of process. I think process that makes people better or makes it safer to fail at things is probably useful.
Yeah.
And the rest I just can't. There's a reason I don't fly much. Also, I get airsick, so that doesn't help. But yes, the FAA has always been just a really interesting case study in bureaucracy.
Yeah. So hiring is an interesting topic, especially in a current post-COVID or wherever the hell we are world. But first question: so, is your philosophy do you grow to hire, or do you hire to grow?
I don't even know if I have a good answer to that right now because we're way behind on hiring.
Okay.
Actually, I have a take on this, and this is because Uber got owned a few weeks ago. Up until September, I was very much like, we need to hire to grow, and if someone's not going to help us grow faster, we're not going to make that hire. And there's a lot that like is not obviously growth related that is useful to have around.
Yeah.
And then as I started thinking about this, Uber got owned, and I was like, we should do work on security. It's not going to help us grow, but we need to do it anyway. And so we'll have a security team soon. It'll be great. But yes, so I don't know if that's an answer to your question. Yes, right. Exactly. Speaking of process, for the sake of it, that's not always tremendously.
Welcome to compliance.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Take more screenshots.
Yes. You have a relatively unique process for hiring people.
We do.
Tell me about that.
We broadly call it work sample based hiring. So we will not look at resumes. Actually, one point of contention within the company recently is we need to use an ATS, an applicant tracking software package.
I'm familiar with the acronym.
Yes, right. None of them let you disable the resume on the apply form.
Ooh.
And I'm banging the desk. We will not ask people for a resume. This is important. I don't care if it's optional. We're not putting it there. We can't use it if it has this. Which is it's kind of persnickety. But I think it's important for at least what we've established with candidates. And so what we do for literally everyone who applies is we give them a take-home project to do that's as close to real work here as we can possibly come up with. The best cases of it is actually a problem we've extracted from existing software here. So if you're a full stack dev, you're getting a kind of a skeleton Phoenix app right now, and we want you to add a feature to it. And we design these to be almost like pass fail. And this works really well for developers. And I could talk at length about applying this to everyone, but in general, you get the idea here. And we want people that are good at this thing. It's someone who already knows Phoenix can be able to do it in 2 hours is kind of the criteria. And someone who doesn't know Phoenix, we want to give them a lot of time to learn it. I think that if people can finish something like that, really good sign. And then we've started pitching this to candidates because, again, you remember we were talking an hour ago about people's expectations matching what's happening here. One of the things about a weird hiring process is that it's surprising to people in a bad way sometimes.
Yeah. And
so we actually lay out for them as instead of doing a phone screen, we do this work sample, but this is basically the equivalent time and energy we expect you to spend on a phone screen. And if you get past that, we actually do something called a work day, which would be the same as getting interviewed somewhere else, but we're doing something slightly different. But over time, you're putting the exact same amount of time into hiring here as you would be somewhere else. And then the workday, they actually, in this remote world, they get on Slack with us for 2 hours, and we basically work on something together. And what happens is two people from the company are in there. One's kind of managing the workday, and the other one acts as their peer, a person they would be working with. And we basically spend 2 hours shipping a feature or kind of building some kind of landing page, or you can imagine any number of other things that someone would be doing during actual work. And the neat thing there is the person helping them isn't screening. Their job is just to help them do well at this. It's one of these things if we can help someone do well at this workday for 2 hours, they're probably worth hiring. It doesn't matter how good they were to start. It doesn't matter how much answering question we had to do. It's that would be a good thing to do.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool. It's kind of interesting. It's weird to do a weird hiring process, but I think everyone's hiring process is terrible. And so why not?
It's part of that is clearly it acts as a filter. Do you think you're filtering people out or you're filtering people in? How do you perceive how that pipeline shakes out?
It's a good question. I think so. One of the things, this was actually modeled after the way orchestras did auditions. And I think it was back in the 90s, orchestras realized they were way over hiring white dudes effectively. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but they were and they thought a lot of the reason for this is that you go sit in an audition and people would be staring at you and judging you for all of these things other than your ability to create music. And so they switched to blind auditions in an attempt to improve basically the diversity of their hiring process. And it helped in some ways. I think a lot more what I'd call like privileged women got orchestra parts than were previously. But one of the things they found over time is it was almost making every other, like, I mean, diversity is weird because it's this like matrix of things.
Yeah.
And so like, if you imagine like highly privileged white people in the United States, they were getting more of like the female variant of a highly privileged white person.
Yeah.
They were getting actually fewer of the like kind of less privileged groups of any gender. The blind audition actually almost what it did is it took away all their opportunities to like kind of mentor people through the process that didn't have the same background. And so if you're really harsh about, we're only going to judge how good they currently are at the music that they're performing behind a screen in this weird environment. You've created this thing where some people just can't do well because they don't have the background to do well. And especially for something like art, you probably don't want it to be as kind of cookie cutter as that, I think. If you listen to 10 people audition and you pick the 2 technically best people, you're probably creating like worse music within the orchestra.
Right.
And so I think in a lot of ways, like our hiring process, it doesn't necessarily, it still selects for people that fit the hiring process in some ways. And so we've been doing a lot of work to try and figure out how to actually get people through the process that don't have the same background as I do. One of the problems we have is that if we put a job up on Hacker News, we get 200 applicants from Hacker News, which is a very distinct set of humans.
Yep.
And they're very good ones in there, but we've started like being careful to not promote our jobs necessarily and to go actually actively recruit from different communities for them, specifically so we can figure out how to like get people who are probably very good at this through the process without getting drowned in people like me.
Right.
I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's a super interesting problem.
No, I think it is. We'll come back. I had another Hacker News question, but we'll come back to that.
Okay.
So sticking with, first of all, why do you know what orchestras were working on hiring in the 90s?
Well, one, my aunt plays for Dallas Symphony, so it's relevant to me.
Yeah.
I actually played tuba in high school and through college. Like I had a musical scholarship. It was $250 a year. It wasn't like a full good one, but
yeah.
Orchestras have always been interesting to me.
Did you know my grandfather was first chair bass in the Toronto Symphony?
I did not know that.
Yeah.
So yeah, you could see why this would be an interesting topic.
Yeah.
But I think when I first started thinking about this work sample based hiring, it was like a lot of this was actually, it wasn't my idea, but it was based in the orchestra stuff. And I just got deep into that. And we did this at Compose too. And so I have how long has it been? Lord, like 9 years of history with this at this point. So I've noticed when things popped up in the news about orchestras.
And were you, let's say because this is a very unique process and I'm sort of interested in the genesis of it. So were you good at hiring at Compose?
Oh God, no, not at first. Actually, one of the things that made this kind of hit home is I think we hired to Compose to 25 people. I'm going to say we hired poorly. And so like 8 of them didn't work out. And it was actually more a knock on our ability to select people that could do well at the company and less a knock on them. And I ended up having to like basically lay people off all at once, and it was terrible. And I hate talking about this because I feel like layoffs are awful for the person that's been laid off, and me.
It was the worst day of my life.
Oh my God, this is so awful for me. It was the most palpable sense of failure. It was terrible in the way that like I'd done a very, very bad job at this. And that's what kind of made it important for us to start working on. And so we got better at it at Compose after that. But it's sort of evolved over time, and we're still getting better at it. And now we're trying to get other people to do this. But yeah, yes, it was because laying people off it's actually awful. It's just like not an awful thing you should be talking about because, oh my God, check your privilege sort of thing.
Right. No, that's the, it's easier to talk about in the safety of a, EO group or whatever. When you talk to other founders or other executives,
exactly.
They're they get it, but it is hard, right? Like you're
It is.
especially at the
It
macro.
should be.
It should be, right.
If it's not hard, there's a problem. That's
Yeah.
the.
Yeah, I think that's an underappreciated self-harm, to borrow your term, part of founding companies, right? Is like there's an element of controlling some unknown or maybe known number of people's destinies
Yep.
based on your decision making. That's
Yeah.
not an easy thing to deal with, whether things are going well or poorly.
Right.
That's something that's always there, right?
Yep. And you can cope with it by becoming something of a psychopath. Like one coping mechanism is to make it not matter to you, which sounds terrifying to me. So
Right. Yeah, I don't know that that's the preferred method, although I
No.
know quite a few people that
Yes.
use that approach.
there's a reason I think like high-end CEO stuff selects frequently for people with like kind of psychopathic tendencies. And
tendencies.
I think it's because they can tolerate the stuff that is actually pretty painful.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're, again, especially if it's a known thing, like I would think if I'm on a board and I know that, based on everything we know as a board, in the next 5 years, we're probably going to have to lay off 5,000 people. I probably want a lead executive in there who's going to be able to handle laying off 5,000 people.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So yes,
Yep.
I'm sure there's a selection bias in there.
There is.
Certainly for hired ones. For people who found companies, I think it's a little different. I think you just
Yeah.
never know what you're getting yourself into.
No.
Second time around, I guess, is
Boiling
easier.
a
but-
frog.
Yeah.
It's harder in entirely different ways. So.
Yes. So are you good at hiring now? Like, how do you feel about your current process?
I don't think it's possibly good at it. I think that this gets into the realm of like, how do you actually judge people's performance? Because hiring is kind of the first part of judging performance. I think good actually looks different than people would expect for this stuff. And so to me, we're getting better at making it predictable. We're getting better at like minimizing negative surprises from hiring through like promotion.
Yep.
Like, but I don't think we'll ever be good at it. It's like I think that we can be marginally better than other companies, and that's a huge win, but that's about as far as it's ever going to go.
Yeah. I think a lot about, which is not a good public view to share probably, but like I think a lot about, ironically, I think of building a small team, right? We'll put company stuff to the side. I think of building a small team like putting a band together.
Yep.
And in a world of, trying to have diversity targets and that sort of thing, I always have a hard time squaring that circle.
Yeah.
Right. I never thought to myself, wow, the Rolling Stones are great, but, I really wish they had more, underprivileged people in the band.
Yep.
That come from different backgrounds. They needed more diversity. Imagine how good the Beatles would have been if they had more diversity. That just doesn't occur to me as like it's something about the chemistry of the people in the room.
Right.
And certainly starting a small startup like at the beginning is about the chemistry of the people in the room. And like I don't know that there's a magic answer to like, how do you know who you're going to, make great music with?
Yeah.
But I know a lot of it is trial and error. But I know that very few of it is done by like, well, we're short a diversity target in the horn section. So we need like,
right.
It's just, it would sound so absurd in that context.
It might sound better than you think, really. So having grown up in music, one of the things that was super interesting to me was to go to New Orleans and watch how the high school band kids played music there versus how I played music in Jinx, Oklahoma, which was Jinx just sounds like a place where upper middle class white kids go to school to me. Probably. I don't know if it sounds that way.
I think you're gonna have to work that out with a therapist, but
I actually, what I think was interesting to me about music there is that there was a whole world of music, and almost like if you consider it like skills for creating music, there was a whole world of skills for creating music. They just did not teach my category of human in Jinx, Oklahoma. We had a very different take on music there. I think one of the interesting things about your music analogy there is like the really successful bands are really good. But if you start thinking about what it takes to build like a group almost from scratch, or just like a fun garage band or whatever, there's actually you can almost imagine how like grabbing a kid that does like street busking in New York or plays their saxophone on the streets of New Orleans would make a much stronger group because they bring so many more tools to the place. And so one of the, like the founding team, so we're a founding team of white dudes. It's not like we're different from other startups here. Sure. But I think what I think a lot of the reason for that is we're also like victims of the environment in some ways. Like you and I have worked with primarily white dudes our whole life because we live in this world where that's who kind of our types of companies have selected for. And like in the worst cases, our types of companies have driven anyone different than that out in a lot of ways. Yeah. And so it's not that I think that it's difficult to separate kind of the macro problem from our individual problem, but I also think it's really important to notice how different backgrounds can actually make a much more interesting product or company or culture. Sure. If you can take advantage of that, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And I also hate the idea of diversity targets is weird to me because it's like, it's not a number you can capture. It's like we have 40 people and there's more than 40 different types of people in this world. Right. But I know that like, if we can attract different types of people, we'll create a better company.
Sure. And that's also a scale thing, right? Like
yes,
at whatever we think of the steps up that a business takes to grow or whatever, like you're not at a point, nor am I at a point, nor have I ever really been at a point where I'm just looking for another cog in the machine. Right. And like, well, since any cog will do, because all I'm doing is building a machine, why don't I choose a cog from this pile as opposed to a cog from this pile?
Right.
Which is different than like, I want to start a band and I want to play this kind of music. And I know that, this guy's got a friend who played in this band and I like the way their band sounded. And it's a scale thing, I think. And
yeah, it's true. It is. It's also like, I think it's different. This sounds super arrogant. We're kind of building a company almost expecting to get to 1,000 people. And like, there's a long way between here and there, but like we sort of know it might be on the horizon. And so like, we've had pretty strong reasons to try and tackle some of this early because we think this is going to happen. That's like, and we all know premature optimization is the root of all evil, but like some of the things, particularly with actually creating diverse companies, is that the longer you wait, the less possible it becomes, I think. If we get to 800 people and then suddenly wake up and be like, oh, wow, this is very, very uniform.
Yeah. Who wants to be the first?
Actually a solvable problem at that point. But anyway, there's a lot that goes into this. And I also have this very strong sense of like treating individuals fairly that gets weird to balance against trying to hire diverse groups. Because like even I mentioned we don't put jobs on Hacker News right now. It's like we're making a selection decision by not doing that. And I think it's okay. And I think it's the right choice. But there's a lot of qualified people on Hacker News that don't get an opportunity for these jobs at the moment because we made that choice.
Sure.
And so there's all kinds of interesting tension here that, I hope it gets better over time. Yeah. And this is, again, another place where like, I think we can be 1% better than other companies. And that's actually really good. So
yeah. Well, and that compounds over 1,000 hires.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. I'm glad you also believe we're getting to 1,000 people. It seems like
I heard it somewhere on the internet. So, okay, let me switch gears one more time on you. Viewer questions. We got the mailbag for Kurt.
Wow.
Oh yeah.
Kurt, Tom Arnold here. I have a quick question. As you know, I'm a big cloud first guy, and I love what you're working on Fly.io. But my quick question is this, and it's a smart one. Why did you decide to use Firecracker as your hypervisor? It's a good question, isn't it? Makes me look smart. Okay, tell me the answer.
Oh boy, that's a fun question. We it wasn't like we did a whole like SWOT analysis or anything and then picked the thing that made the most sense. It was very much we were going from multi-tenant JavaScript runtime, V8 isolates, to we just need to run people's Docker images. And I'm like deeply uncomfortable with kind of container isolation in Linux. And Firecracker was like kind of similar semantics, but I felt safe with. That's literally it. It seemed good enough for what we were trying to do at the time. There's probably a lot of other options at this point. Also, it was relatively early. Like Firecracker's hot now, but it wasn't. We were probably the first not Amazon company to use it for real. There's a couple of other like KVM based things. We looked at gvisor, which is Google's different way of sandboxing containers, and it was slow enough to matter when we were playing with this stuff, but it probably wasn't. It was like we'd already decided on Firecracker. We just wanted to check and make sure we were correct at that point.
Okay. Kurt, big fan of what you guys are building. What is the coolest thing you feel Fly has built so far?
Okay, we have this stupid feature that is actually really powerful, which is this Fly replay header. And all this does is it lets your app say, try this request again somewhere else. And you can say on a different app, you can say in a different region, you can say to a specific VM. And this came from, I don't know, you probably know this, but this came from one of the most powerful things an edge proxy can do is be good at retrying things. I don't know how often you all run into this, but like you can cover up a lot of problems if you can just be smart about retrying stuff.
Yep.
And we were kind of what we were doing is we were looking at how to do global databases. And one of the things that's neat about this company, Critical Compose, is we actually run the app and the proxy and the database. So you can kind of look at the whole stack, and then you can like build a proxy feature that makes the database life easier. And we had this moment where we're like, what if we could just let the app tell us to do a retry? Because then we can run read replicas all over the place. We can have a primary database in Chicago. You know, the app server in Sydney can be like, hey, I can't handle this. Just do this in Chicago instead. And you basically like remove all of the problems a developer would have to solve by running like regional replicas. And so we ended up just using the same retry infrastructure for this replay header. The neatest, like the coolest thing about it, I think, is how often it becomes useful. So now we have a product called Fly Machines, which is just get VMs very close to users very fast, like individual ones. One of the things they're good for is running untrusted user code. So you can build your own functions as a service with machines. But the architecture people end up using for this is they run a global router app, and then they run individual apps and machines for their users. And all that happens is a request comes in, and then they use that same replay header to say, go to this machine for this user instead. And so it's turned into this Swiss Army knife feature that was actually like pretty small because we'd done all this other stuff.
Right.
That still like, I still kind of cackle when I get to do something with it.
Cackling is good.
Yes. Is it like maximize the cackles?
Yes. Here's a question I don't know about you, although I can imagine. Tell me, what was your hometown in Oklahoma?
Tulsa. I grew up.
Where did you say it was?
Jinx was a suburb of Tulsa.
Okay, it's a suburb. I was going to say, because when we went to Tulsa, I don't think we went to Jinx. Or is that where we
did
got
not
barbecue?
go to Jinx. We were on the north side of Tulsa. Jinx is the south side.
Got it. So, a young Kurt in Jinx, Oklahoma. What were you like as a student?
I was a terrible student. I'm really bad at homework. I'm still kind of bad at that class of problems where it's work for no obvious reason, I think, in many ways. My only saving grace was that I was good at tests. So like I kind of got through high school just on the strength of tests and poor homework skills. And then I went to college, and one of the counselors was like, you're just lazy. And like lately I've been like, I don't think that was the problem. I feel like that maybe we shouldn't use those words for this thing. Yeah. So as an adult, I've recognized there was some kind of personality thing that made a lot of this difficult for me. It wasn't just pure laziness. But then I did a lot, like back in the 90s. I distinctly remember what I wanted to do was go work for Pixar. I basically wanted to create 3D, like create movies of some kind. I loved animation. And I pirated 3D Studio Max and ended up just building all these little videos and things, which like I got no grade for, but I certainly applied myself to those.
Yeah.
So, that was probably a lot of us in high school were like crap at the actual work. And then we found a thing that we poured all our energy into instead.
Yeah. I think there's a common thread, especially amongst founder types, about
some kind of applied executive functioning disorder.
Well,
probably
just in general, that whole like, anything I couldn't see the point of, I never did.
Yeah.
Like that
no patience for process.
Like yes, like word for word, that was my high school experience as well, right? It was just like, why would I choose to spend my valuable time on this stupid problem you're presenting me?
But by the way, there's no amount of success I can have in my life that's going to make my mom feel okay with me dropping out of engineering in college.
Yeah.
She's still not. She's just never going to feel like she feels like a failure because of that. I can't do anything at this point to make that okay. It's really funny.
Yeah. Honorary degree, maybe. You gotta
Maybe. I don't know. I think still, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I have one more, although I think I know where it's going based on our earlier conversation, but story time with Kurt. Tell us what your greatest day in your business career has been, and what the worst day in your business career has been, in either order that you choose.
You're probably not going to guess the worst day. The worst day was we had a security breach at Mongo HQ that I still will not talk much about because I just don't enjoy bringing it up again. And I was out of town, kind of holed up in a hotel room dealing with what seemed like the end of the world at the time. Like in hindsight, it didn't have as big of impact as I thought it would. Still like emotionally devastating sort of problem. So when you hear me say things like, no, we're having a security team, because it was like kind of treating past trauma in some ways, but it's also like it's a good choice. There's a reason that we're doing this right now. So that was by far the worst work day of all time. I'm trying to think of what the best one was. It's definitely shipping something. I think I've been lucky enough that this has happened a few times, but like launching anything that people pay some attention to is definitely the best day. I don't know which specific thing it was because it almost, I feel like we're going to be lucky and I'm going to get to do that a few more times. What is that? The machines I mentioned earlier, we launched in May and it was very cool. And I don't even know how big the overall impact was, but people seem to like it. And it was like, cool. This is like the best day ever for work. And I just live off those endorphins for the next 3 months.
Shipping something is a good answer. All right. Last but not least. Well, we'll go to where we started. What's the one piece of technology you wish would go away, die, or is most under delivering?
Oh my gosh. Anything. So, I actually think the most under delivering is anything that involves me putting information into a computer. Like, I think one of the weirdest things about remote work is how useless it is for me to draw on like a piece of paper or a whiteboard. And that's still the best way to think about things. And so we've kind of created this world now where like the way that I think I can't actually like use to communicate. It's like so I just don't do it anymore. I think that like pin-based inputs on computers are not doing what they should be, or there's something else missing there. Yeah. And also AirPods should just die.
Well then, on that note,
yes,
Kurt, thank you very much for your time.
Yes,
it is always a pleasure.
Thanks for loading that up with things like airplanes. I think that makes life a lot easier when you also talk about things that I have a history with. So.
Yes. Well, everybody loves airplanes except the people who absolutely hate them.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks again. Good to see your smiling face. Hopefully in person sooner than later.
Yep.
And good luck with Fly.
Yes. Thank you.
Good luck with the tuba. Do you have a tuba?
I don't have a trombone that my dog is terrified of.
Okay.
So I have not played in a while.
Got it. All right. I won't ask you to play on the spot then. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Cheers.
Another round, so much more to talk about. Gonna aim to satisfy with help from CashFly. Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast. The Anycast podcast, brought to you by CashFly.